Welcome to HEC TV Live. Today's program, Abraham Lincoln and the Passage of the 13th Amendment. Hi everybody, I'm Tim Gore, your host for HEC TV Live, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the program today. An important topic for sure, but one made even more perhaps known to everybody because of the recent film release of the movie Lincoln, directed by Steven Spielberg. As part of their media campaign, the movie group is actually going to be releasing the DVD version of the film to every middle school and every high school in the country as part of their Stand Tall, Live Like Lincoln program. As a result, we're able to use in today's program some excerpts from the movie, as well as excerpts from various members of the cast, screenwriter and Spielberg himself, as they talk about the impact of Lincoln and specific aspects of this story of him passing the 13th Amendment. We're going to focus today on Abraham Lincoln the man and the passage of the 13th Amendment. As we do so, we'll talk about that political process. We'll be able to make comparisons to the political process today, and we're being joined by an historian who's going to help us put everything into perspective, Justin Blandford. Justin, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thanks for the invitation, Tim. I'm glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. Let the students know what you get to do as superintendent of the State Historic Sites in Springfield. What does it mean to be part of the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency?
Well, I'm a historian and manager for 5 state-owned historic sites in Springfield, Illinois, and that includes the Lincoln Tomb, the State House where Lincoln worked, called the Old State Capitol, and Lincoln's Law Office, the only remaining building where he leased space and had an office from 1843 until about 1852.
We're looking at video now of the Old State Capitol building. We're going to see both interior and exterior shots. And it's my understanding that Daniel Day-Lewis, as part of his preparation for the role, actually came and visited the site?
That's exactly right. And the room that they're seeing right now is Representative Hall, where Lincoln worked as a representative in the winter of 1840. And that was a room that Daniel Day-Lewis had a specific interest in, and he asked to be alone in for a few minutes. I'm told that he recorded in a later interview with another journalist that it's in that room that he first heard inside himself the voice of Lincoln that he wished to use for the movie.
Now, talk a little bit about Lincoln, the man as we know him in that period of time. Are there certain things that establish in his character that we'll eventually see later as we think in terms of what happens during his presidency?
Absolutely. More than any other place, the Springfield Historic Sites capture the work ethic of Abraham Lincoln. He worked there for almost 2 decades leading up to the presidency, gave some of his most famous remarks. The most famous thing he said in his pre-presidential years was his House Divided speech. He said that in the room that we just saw in the movie clip. And so the buildings in Springfield, the historic sites that we maintain for the public to enjoy, provided the arena for Lincoln to compete. These are the places where he honed his skills, developed the talents that we see on display in the movie, and of course, we recognize in the iconic figure known as Abraham Lincoln.
We're going to have a chance to talk a lot about Lincoln the man as we talk about the specific example of passing the 13th Amendment in this particular program. The law office image that you saw there obviously still exists in Springfield today. You can tour that. But we want to give you some insight into the man by looking at this particular example very much in the same way that the movie makers did. There's a lot of things you could choose to talk about, obviously, when you have a subject as large and important as Abraham Lincoln. And they chose to focus specifically on the passage of the 13th Amendment, as is our program today. And interestingly enough, that movie actually begins in just 6 pages of this book you're seeing right here, Doris Kearns Goodwin's amazing historical book, Team of Rivals, where she specifically speaks for a little bit of time about the passage of the 13th Amendment. To give you an idea about what she thinks of Lincoln, and obviously she lived with him a long time as she wrote the book, here's an excerpt from Doris Kearns Goodwin and her thoughts on the man.
The overall perception was that this man was an extraordinary statesman, that he was an ethical leader, and that there was a certain melancholy attached to him, a sadness to his life and to his death. And what I discovered through the letters and the diaries is that, number one, it's true he was melancholy, but he had an incredible sense of humor and a great storytelling ability. And he used that to be able to undo the sadness that he felt inside. So I hadn't expected to laugh as much in Living with Lincoln as I did, nor did I expect to find what a political genius he was.
We're going to learn a lot about the man as we look at this example, and obviously we're going to learn a lot about the political process as well. And I think one of the interesting things that you'll be able to do today is think about comparing this moment in time in passing major legislation to today's moments in time when we attempt to pass major legislation. Are the process similar? Is the process different? We'll have a chance to look at that historically. We're going to cover 3 major areas today as we talk about the passage of the 13th Amendment. First, we're going to look at the Emancipation Proclamation and why Lincoln felt that was not enough, that there was a need for a 13th Amendment to the Constitution, why the Emancipation Proclamation was not good enough in order to make sure that slavery was eliminated. Secondly, we'll look at the timing for the push of the passage of this amendment, why they chose to do it when they did, and thirdly, then, we'll look at the political process for passing the amendment. All three things, of course, important when you're talking about political acts today. But let's begin by giving you an overview of the entire story, and I'm not sure if anything does it better than the trailer from the film Lincoln itself.
We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
We can't tell our people they can vote yes on abolishing slavery unless at the same time we can tell them that you're seeking a negotiated peace.
It's either the amendment or this Confederate peace. You cannot have both.
How many hundreds of thousands have died during your administration?
Congress must never declare equal those whom God created unequal.
Leave the Constitution alone. We are stepped out upon the world stage now, with the fate of human dignity in our hands. Blood's been spilled to afford us this moment. Now!
Abraham Lincoln has asked us to work with him to accomplish the death of slavery.
No one's ever been loved so much by the people. Don't waste that power.
This fight is for the United States of America.
This settles the fate for all coming time. Not only of the millions now in bondage, but of unborn millions to come. Shall we stop this bleeding?
The trailer provides, I think, a really compelling overview of what will be the subject matter we're going to talk about today. I'm sure some folks might be interested as an historian looking at that trailer. Talk a little about the historical accuracy you see there and the way that's handled in the film.
Well, I think it's handled very delicately in the film and very accurately in the film. There's a significant amount of what we read as text, what we hear as voice in the film that is used, borrowed from letters and very well delivered through the movie. Of course, there are a number of conversations that we don't know about, that people weren't present for. But for those scenes, they are relying on other inferences and things like that. So as much as a film can be connected to the historiography of this movement toward the 13th Amendment, I think this one does a very fine job, and it is really a wonderful way for people to access some of the historical material, hopefully pique their curiosity and send them into their libraries to do more research.
So let's talk about a little bit the Emancipation Proclamation. What was the rationale here? Why is Lincoln issuing this thing halfway through what would be the war?
Well, what we're finding out is there are strategic reasons for this. There's also political reasons for issuing this document. And I think internally and personally for Abraham Lincoln, what we see first and foremost is the leader of the North and the leader of the country, not recognizing the rebellion, arrives personally at the place where we need to begin to move toward equality and looking at the issue of slavery in terms of a moral issue. So understanding that the Emancipation Proclamation had a limit of scope, it had legal questions that could be thrown at it, and at the end of a war, the duration question comes up.
Well, let's talk about some of those things. Let's break those down. First of all, the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to certain states, correct? The states in rebellion, slaves in rebellious states.
That's right, slave-holding states in rebellion, and not the border states, which is also a very technical piece of this. The states bordering the North and the South that Lincoln handled very, very carefully, not wanting to push them into the South entirely.
So an example of a border state being Kentucky, for example, his home state, so to speak, where he was born. Slaves still existed in Kentucky, even though the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued, because Kentucky was not in rebellion against the federal government.
That's right, and you had political leaders who were personally loyal to Abraham Lincoln. And so there is, in some ways, an unwritten agreement that is standing between the leaders of those border states and the president that they are going to take this issue step by step and follow through to see the result. Again, he's hoping to keep them politically tied to the Union to show strength and to keep a weaker Southern bloc.
In terms of enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't kick in, obviously, until Union forces went somewhere in the South. And in practical terms, then, did Union forces free slaves? How did that work or did not work?
Well, there was laws actually set up that would help give direction to troops that would let them know how they were to handle freed blacks who would arrive at their lines. And so there's actually, sort of a process that has to take place there. But many people would argue, and especially Southern leaders at the time, that Lincoln had no authority to do that in the South. Many abolitionists also made the same argument, saying that Lincoln didn't go far enough because he had limited authority to do so. So that's complicated for people who are on both in the North and in the South in terms of the basis for Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation.
And the proclamation actually allowed freed blacks then to join the military?
And that's a critical piece of it, Tim. In fact, it allowed blacks to muster in where before a federal law prevented African Americans from serving as soldiers. Now, thousands and thousands of African Americans served in different capacities, but were not allowed to fight. And that is a very, very big issue for abolitionists. That is a very big issue for free blacks living in the North, and for those who flee slavery and connect to a Union line, that they can be part of the process that's going to deliver equality. Very, very instrumental.
And so there was real concern then that once the war was over, and obviously in 1865, the beginning of 1865, when the passage is going to actually occur, the war is beginning to wind down. There's a real sense amongst Lincoln and the Union generals and everything that we're going to win this thing.
Absolutely. What we have to be careful of, though, is not thinking about what was next. And, of course, we have the benefit of hindsight, and we see this now as part of a long continuum. And we know what happened next, but they didn't know at the time. So Lincoln is also trying to begin to control the events that will come after the war. He's trying to look on both sides of the aisle, the Republicans and the Democrats, that he's going to need to work with to restore peace and now deliver equality to people it had previously been denied.
Well, let's look at the text of the 13th Amendment, which is obviously what we're talking about today. Very quickly, very clearly, what it states here, that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And then Congress obviously gets the power to enforce the article. Where did this wording come from?
It's pulled from an area of the Northwest Ordinance, and Lyman Trumbull, one of Lincoln's colleagues back from Illinois, who was a U.S. Senator, was very instrumental in helping to connect that to the amendment. I mean, its brevity is very, very clear. And so what they're doing is they're looking back at other documents that were effective and bringing that effectiveness forward by instilling it and connecting it to the 13th Amendment.
Because slavery had never been part of the Northwest Territories, and so obviously that wording had worked very effectively for keeping it out of what we would think of today as like Michigan and that area of the country.
Absolutely. Politicians like Stephen Douglas were effective in allowing for the spread of slavery areas not under the Northwest Ordinance, what we now call the southwestern part of the United States. They were coming into our government in a different way, an idea called popular sovereignty. But that Northwest Ordinance had it really empowered Lincoln and other politicians to argue that that land should remain forever free.
Under the Missouri Compromise of 1820, we'd established that longitudinal line there where slavery could exist and where slavery couldn't exist, but now there's real concern. Texas is going to come into the Union, Oklahoma. We're going to deal with California territories. So there's concern that there will be new additional slave territories that obviously would not be affected by the Northwest Ordinance at all.
That's exactly right. 1845 is sort of a great watershed year because at the end of that year, Texas goes from being an independent republic to being part of the United States. And right after that, we see a fast track of expansion that earlier generations of political leaders did not have to deal with.
Now, there's also something known as the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which I think would be good for us to look at. Let's bring that text up now. You'll see the powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states. So I'm assuming Lincoln, obviously as president, very aware of this, had thought about this in advance. His concern is when the war is over, without a constitutional amendment, some former rebellious state could choose to institute slavery again, or a border state could just keep going with it.
That's absolutely right. And we can look back into the 1830s and we can see states' rights issues coming up on topics like the tariff. And so states' rights had really been a very big issue for a long time in our country, and it continued to be utilized by individuals like Stephen Douglas, Abraham Lincoln's most serious rival throughout most of his professional life, as really the way to let people vote whether or not they wanted to live in a free state or a slave state. And so that's the idea of popular sovereignty that's coming out there. And as late as 1857, we have territories out in the Southwest that are being brought into statehood through the idea of popular sovereignty. So we're seeing this getting remarkably close to the beginning of the Civil War, and that was making people like Abraham Lincoln extremely nervous about the future of the United States.
And that states' rights issue continues to exist. When you think about comparing political process and moments at this time to political process and moments at this time, now, then indeed we're still talking about states' rights issues all the time. This is an important part of what is our federal system of government.
That's right, the separation of powers.
Very good. So we have then the situation, the Emancipation Proclamation Lincoln perceives is just not strong enough. When the war is over, obviously the states will no longer be in rebellion. Therefore, who knows what might happen to those slaves? And he's also got to think in terms of children that could be born of those slaves, even that might have been born after the war had ended, correct?
That's exactly right. And in the trailer clip that we saw, he mentions the word unborn. And that was incredibly important, not only unborn, but again, also children. And that was a big question mark that they wanted to resolve. And of course, that translates into the future. That's what this is really about. It's not about the moment in time necessarily or exclusively at the end of the war, but also what will the direction of the country be in the future? Which way will it go?
So he's made the decision now that the Emancipation Proclamation is enough. He begins to move for passage of the amendment. And even though we're going to be talking about January of 1865, when the House of Representatives does indeed pass it by the two-thirds majority, that process has actually begun much sooner than that, right?
That's exactly right. So it had started. It was working behind the scenes. And of course, the first attempt failed, and so that's when we arrive at the scene that's highlighted in the movie.
The Senate, the United States Senate, had actually passed the amendment by the two-thirds majority in April of 1864, but it failed in the House of Representatives.
That's correct, and that's what makes the scenes in the House from the movie really, sort of the hotbed moments of what's going on, the most tense scenes going on, because that's where it failed initially. So we find ourselves coming back to those very scenes, to the divided representatives who are trying to articulate their different sides and come to some sort of resolution on this issue.
Now, Lincoln, of course, could have chosen then in 1864 to say, okay, I tried, passed in the Senate, failed in the House, but instead what he decides to do is to, in essence, kind of up the ante, so to speak, on it, because he instructs the Republican Party that as part of our platform for the 1864 presidential election, I want us to put something in there about an amendment banning slavery.
And by making that part of the platform, he opens it up into the public discourse in a way that it had never been before. And of course, knowing that, if he wins, that gives him the ability, the real fuel, if you will, to take that discourse into the leadership body, into the Congress of the United States, and try and hammer out an amendment.
You mentioned going to the public, and that goes along with a great email question we received from Jim about Lincoln strategically using the bully pulpit. How was he able to do that? What would you gauge? How effective was he at doing that kind of thing?
Well, he certainly realized that power, and there's wonderful quotes in the movie about him being clothed in power and him being a very powerful person. So he realized the authority of the president for sure. And sometimes he uses that in a soft way, and we see that by engaging sort of lobbyists behind the scenes who will work on representatives each of their own. And when that's not effective, then Lincoln brings his own personal experience in. But Lincoln realized that the words that he offered to the public were extremely influential, and so he would decide very carefully which ideas might be shared through correspondence that would certainly be kept private, and then some of those pieces of correspondence he knew would become part of the public discourse. And so he is very, very savvy about the way that he uses that pulpit. Sometimes it's very exposed and very open, and other times it's much more behind the scenes, but at the same time still shared with the public.
Now, the results of the election are obviously very successful for the Republican Party. Lincoln wins again, and the Republican increases their majority in the House of Representatives and the Senate. In case you don't know, when people got inaugurated back then is different than when they get inaugurated today. So the new Congress wasn't going to take over until March of 1865. Lincoln wasn't going to be inaugurated until March of 1865. But there's a lame duck session that's going to occur now between there. We have those kind of lame duck sessions still today. The election happens in November, and they frequently go back and do stuff in December, and then the new Congress takes over in January. But we're kind of left with an interesting question. Knowing that you're going to have more Republicans in the House in March, thus making it perhaps easier to get passage, what are the motivations for Lincoln saying, no, I want it done in January anyway. I want it done by the end of January. He's really quite specific about it. I want it done by the end of January 1865. What motivates him there? How does that give us an idea of who this man is?
Well, he definitely realizes that there are people who are not going to be elected officials that may be willing to work with him. And so that is definitely a path that's open to him. And I think it most clearly illustrates his seriousness about getting this accomplished. Now, we can look back and see that, okay, this would have been an opportunity for him, but we don't know how that opportunity in March might have turned out. And so this is an opportunity, and I think he just expresses his sincere desire and makes a full-fledged effort at trying to get it done and is successful in doing so. So he sees some willing candidates there in these lame duck candidates, and also it has an opportunity to show some bipartisan support. He knows that this is an amendment that both Republicans and Democrats are going to have to live with. And so if he can bring more of them to the table and get them to sign on to this now, that's going to help him present this to the people that they represent in the future.
So there's a very much a political pragmatist moment coming out in Lincoln, realizing that the amendment does get passed, all folks are going to have to live with it. So if I've got both votes from both sides of the aisle, that helps make it palatable to the public, so to speak. And it's also the realization from the strategy perspective that there are folks who are going to be out of a job in March. So maybe I can influence them in some way to change their vote and vote for the amendment now, because they aren't going to go back to their constituents and have to worry about the fallout, so to speak.
That's exactly right. It also deals a blow to Southern morale. And so Lincoln, riding a little bit of a wave after the election, is going to leverage this to continue to, increase the support that he's gaining militarily. And it's very helpful to him in that manner, too.
We also want to give you an opportunity to hear from Tony Kushner, the screenwriter for Lincoln, because he obviously looked at this timing issue a great deal, and it gave him some interesting insight into the man as he wrote the script.
When you watch the way in which Lincoln finessed the question of slavery, which again is part of what our movie is about, you see somebody who with a kind of unbelievable mastery, understands how to move the population through talking and through legislation and action, how to move the hearts and minds of the people to a better place, how to wait for them when you really have to wait, and also how to have faith in them that they're ready, even maybe a little bit before they realize that they're ready. And had Lincoln done what he is shown in our film doing in 65, in 61, the war would have been lost by the North. The South would have, I think without any question, have seceded. The border states would have gone over, and it would all have been over. And, it took an incredible strength of character and a willingness to be attacked by some people that you really admire, as well as by people you would prefer to have as your enemies.
Really interesting things there from Kushner, because obviously abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison are really upset with Lincoln that he hasn't moved faster. Other people are, so you get people who are thinking, oh, he's being wishy-washy, he's being namby-pamby, he's not being good enough, and he's got to kind of withstand all that pressure and really make a political decision about what is the right timing.
And Tim, it was formidable pressure. These aren't arguments that are coming from 1, 2, or 3 people. There are literally tens of thousands of people who feel these different ways throughout the North and the South. So it's a very, very complex set of pressures that are brought to bear on Abraham Lincoln. And he's exactly right. He was an incredibly patient individual, an amazing listener, a wonderful politician who was able to use his strengths to slowly move people along, just as he had been moved slowly along. Lincoln doesn't think the same thing about slavery in 1841 that he does in 1861. He changed over time. He himself had been moved by other people. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, moved many people throughout the North because they had not been exposed to the horrors of slavery. And so Lincoln, by that force and many others, had been shaped, and he was finally aware of how to shape other people.
Very good. Let's begin to go to some student questions. Elkhart Lake Middle School, do you all have a question right now? Go right ahead.
I was curious, how far south did Lincoln travel to get reelected? Did he travel throughout the South during the war, to get popular votes? What did he do?
Great question.
Did he remain in Washington?
That's a great question. And Lincoln wouldn't have traveled south at all in 1864. He didn't travel south in 1860. Lincoln was based in the Capitol building in Springfield, and that's where he stayed. It was actually thought to be impolite by many people for politicians to be out there campaigning. Interestingly, his rival, Stephen Douglas, breaks that mold, and Douglas is actually in Mobile, Alabama on Election Day. But Lincoln did not appear on a single Southern ballot in 1860. And so obviously he knew he wasn't going to gain any popularity there during the wartime. So it's very much a methodology, a strategy based on the Electoral College, based on the numbers that he knew he had to get to win.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting little historical tidbit. One, about the Electoral College. It's all about which states you win in the Electoral College. That still applies today. And kind of the approach to political campaigning for presidential candidates back then, where they didn't. I mean, and that's actually a more recent phenomenon than you might think. It's still in the 20th century when Warren Harding is sitting on the porch in Ohio as opposed to going out and campaigning, which has obviously changed greatly now with the advent of television and everything else. We've gotten an email question from Poplar, Montana, and thanks to all our friends in Poplar, Montana for this question. It's kind of an interesting question dealing with how the way we perceive political parties today is different back then. But because they ask about the flip between political parties, and that's a good thing for us to talk about here as we get into the part of passing it. It is the Republicans who are for this, at this point in time, who are for the passage of the 13th Amendment, what might be seen as a more liberal position, and it is the Democratic Party of the time who are advocating what might be perceived as the more conservative position of states' rights, correct?
That's correct, but we do need to remember that the Republican Party was extremely young at that point, very, very unstable, and made up of numerous factions of other political organizations, including what would be called anti-Nebraska or anti-Douglas, meaning anti-Stephen Douglas Democrats. So the Republican Party at that point is really been forged from lots of different groups that have been brought together and very much anew in its identity. But that is correct. It was the first party to make this part of their platform. And Lincoln came to that party from being an old-line Whig, which was a considerable block of the new Republican Party.
Let's get down to brass tacks. Okay, we've made the decision now, we're going to do it. And all the moral power in the world of the position of concerning the amendment, or of course all the power that's clothed in the office of the presidency, doesn't matter much if you can't deliver votes on a certain day. And they needed to deliver votes on January 31, 1865. There are people opposed to the amendment for states' rights issues and perhaps other issues as well. But let's talk a little bit about the difference of getting something passed through the House of Representatives versus the Senate. Because the Senate, obviously, at this point in time, people may or may not remember their history. Senators were not elected directly by the people. They were appointed, correct, by the governor or political conventions in states?
State legislatures.
State legislatures. And so, but still, that senator is probably representing the whole state because he had to get a pretty good amount of people to vote for him. But a congressman is representing a particular part of a state. So you might have a part of a state which is really opposed to the amendment, while the senator could be able to say, no, the whole state is. So talk a little bit about the nature of dealing with the representatives.
Well, that's certainly the case. These are the grassroots individuals, the grassroots popularly elected individuals. Lincoln had been a representative, so he was acutely aware of the process. He had been in Washington from 1847 to 1849. He's aware of the kind of deal-making that has to go on, the counting of votes, and what it takes to get the number you need to get the amendment passed. So he is aware of the process. He's good at it, and he employs people to work with him to get that done. He can't do this all on his own, and he needs people to reach out and go after the votes that are sort of on the fence, so to speak, that he can bring in to the fold and help get the majority that he needs to pass the amendment. And so that is a significant part of the film, and a very exciting part of the film, is seeing that deal-making going on where we're watching these representatives be approached, being offered potentially opportunities that might benefit them, and then watching the personal struggle that they go to because they know they're going to have to answer to the people that they represent. Whether or not they're coming back into the next Congress is really beside the point. They're still going to have to go home and face those people.
Let's talk a little bit about this patronage activity that he had to do.
Absolutely. Well, there are individuals who at the end of this session are going to be out of a job. And so Lincoln is, as president, has the power of patronage, that he is able to put individuals, appoint individuals to a certain number of positions, typically in the federal government. And so, that's something that still exists today. And, presidents build their cabinets, governors appoint agency directors, and a certain number of high-level, state government employees and different things like that. So that's something that's still alive and well today. It's part of our process, and it's certainly, in a way that something they've earned as an elected official, that they can bring in the team that's going to help them get the work done. And a number of these are, up to the president or the elected official to give away to the people that they think have deserved or earned or may be good at those jobs. So he has that as something that he can offer out to people who are going to be looking for something to do. And it is something we see in the movie, obviously, that is enticing to many of them because they need to continue to provide for their family. They will also want to continue to be involved in the political process. And as someone who has struggled to be in the process for more than 2 decades, Abraham Lincoln is keenly aware of how attractive that placement is for some of these people.
And Lincoln's very good at dealing with people. I mean, in terms of regaling them with stories or being really accessible to them and making them feel good about the conversation and about doing what he would want them to do. And I think we've got a clip we're going to run from both the film as well as from Tony Kushner and from Daniel Day-Lewis when they talk about what they think about Lincoln's accessibility. So we can talk a little bit about the man, and we'll reach that.
Euclid's first common notion is this: things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other.
It's the man himself that invites you because he was so open, and that was one of the most beautiful surprises of getting to know him was how insanely accessible that man was. At the time, it was actually physically very dangerous, in his case, to be accessible. But
it's very clear from every contemporary account that he had that effect on people. He was very approachable, very familiar, very easy to talk to, a great listener, a great conversationalist, and people would just come up to him all the time and yell at him or thank him or whatever. He wasn't at all intimidating in that way, but anybody who spent any amount of time with him started to get the feeling that they were in the presence, from the time that he was a boy, got the feeling that there was something else going on that was not entirely what we think of as being sort of normally human, something bigger than that.
That's a rule of mathematical reasoning. It's true because it works. Has done and always will do. In his book, Euclid says this is self-evident. You see, there it is, even in that 2,000-year-old book of mechanical law. It is a self-evident truth that things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other.
How important, really, is it to the success of the passage of this amendment that Lincoln's personality is so personable, is so accessible, can be so down-home folksy? Doris Kearns Goodwin talks about a specific example of him dealing with a legislature here in the book. That's obviously something that existed in the time he was in the Illinois legislature, too.
And it contributed to his success prior to the presidency immensely. So I think it's very, very important. And we do see it play out in the film, not to be a spoiler alert here or anything, but there certainly is a point when Lincoln has to step in personally and play an active role. And so it's very, very important that he be accessible and that he be very approachable. For those that he is bringing these ideas to are going to be guarded. And so he has to, in a way, disarm them through humor, through storytelling, the tools that come to him naturally, and use his political power to achieve a result that they feel they've arrived at on their own.
Yes. He can't do it alone, however. There's got to be some other people who carry the water, so to speak. And obviously the political operatives who are working on trying to get the patronage deal are carrying a lot of water. But Thaddeus Stevens, who's the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, has got to carry the water too, so to speak. Give us a little information about this Thaddeus Stevens, representative from Pennsylvania.
Well, in terms of carrying water toward the 13th Amendment, he'd been carrying this a lot longer than Abraham Lincoln. And so what we see in the film play out is these two individuals who are now joined toward the same goal, but have often been at odds with each other. And so they have to find a way to work together, in many ways trust each other, that this will really result in what they're talking about. And that's a difficult thing to happen in a political process when we see individuals coming from different perspective and sometimes with different end goals in mind. But it does work out here, and we do see these individuals brought together, unified behind the 13th Amendment.
Very good. Let's go to more student questions. Canton, Ohio, back to you. Another question from you.
What propaganda did Abraham Lincoln use to get elected?
Oh, great. Let's talk a little bit about that campaign process, propaganda, pamphlets. How was it done back then?
Well, one of the things we can wind back and look at is the election of 1860. And so there had been a whole new group of individuals that sprout up in 1860 called the Wideawakes. and they were there to create enthusiasm and to bring attention to the campaign. And then they also served as election judges. So there is some identifiers in 1860 of the political process as we see it today, and some of that was really just starting then. And so that's a new foundation for Abraham Lincoln that really hadn't been there for other politicians. And I think the other thing that's important that happens in 1864 is we see this idea of equality brought into the actual the party platform. That's something very different. 4 years earlier, the message had been much more squarely focused on unity, and now the tone has changed. And again, if he's successful, that gives him the ability to go back to the people and remind them what they elected him on.
It's going to be close on this vote. I mean, Thaddeus Stevens is working hard, Lincoln is working hard, but there's no guarantee that we're necessarily going to get a two-thirds majority. And at the same moment in time that there's this worry about whether or not we're going to get the two-thirds majority, there comes this rumor that perhaps there are Confederate peacemakers in the Capitol and that perhaps the Confederacy is ready to sue for peace. And some people perceive that, we need to wait then. We don't want to vote for this amendment now because if we could end the war without it, we'd be, from their perspective, would be better off. Talk about the worry about that and how it affected very closely when the vote's happening.
Well, the concern behind that would be that would really deflate the opportunity to move for the passage of the 13th Amendment. If national unity takes over again is the sort of the primary goal and overshadows the idea of ending slavery, then maybe that's something in Lincoln's mind would be a concern that the public will settle for, and he doesn't want to settle for that. So that's another one of the reasons that moving quickly is very, very important. He has a good idea of what is on people's minds, that this is good timing, and he's not going to want to risk it by waiting maybe 2 or 3 more months to elongate this discussion. And the threat of a negotiated peace becomes more and more likely because the war weighed extremely heavily on the population, and there's no doubt about it, they wanted it to end. And if the thought of a negotiated peace was a sure reality or something they thought might actually happen, it would swipe away those ideas that the 13th Amendment could come in and that slavery would actually be brought to an end everywhere.
We had an email question that came to us from Pennsylvania. Do you think Lincoln could have passed the amendment without this behind-the-scene deal-making?
I think it's possible. Of course, that's the kind of question historians avoid, really. But in general, I think it's possible. It seems to me, just studying Lincoln's character, studying Lincoln's political will and his abilities, he would have been prepared, with Plan B or Move 2, so to speak, that would enable him to come forward. But certainly, the drama of the movie makes it clear, and I think the reality was probably not all that different, that the votes are close, the timing was important, and this is really when Lincoln needed to make it happen. And again, another question historians don't like is the what if, but if it didn't happen, then he has politically suffered a blow that would have strengthened Southern morale, and that would have been very, very difficult for him to deal with at that time.
So he really was putting himself out there, so to speak.
He really was putting himself out there, exposing the relationships that he needed to leverage to pass the 13th Amendment and applying the political pressure that he had collected as president and really exchanging it in on this opportunity.
The vote, however, is successful. Doesn't pass by a great majority. It gets a 2/3, but not by a lot. And interestingly enough, it's helped by the fact that 6 members of the House of Representatives actually vote absent, because the total is based on the amount of those actually voting. So some people were able to, I guess, in essence, help the amendment pass without having to take a stand that maybe back in their home district would have made it difficult for them to get reelected.
It's a subtle maneuver, but definitely one that helped move the 13th Amendment across the finish line in Congress. And then I guess that's just one step. Lincoln was also concerned about the need to have the state approval, and it moved directly. In fact, in some states, including Illinois, the next day, would be cabled out to those states to begin that ratification process.
And the ratification actually is fairly rapid. By, I think it's December of 1865, the appropriate amount of states have ratified it. But interestingly enough, it might be surprising to some people to learn that some states failed to ratify it the first time and then came back to it many, 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 many years later. Like maybe they just forgot it, lost it in their legislative archive somewhere, but like the state of Mississippi didn't pass the amendment not very many years ago at all.
That's correct. And there's some other states a little closer to the north that did the same thing.
I believe Delaware voted against
New Jersey,
it, and New Jersey too, and didn't come back for a long period of time before they voted on it again. But indeed, it does get ratified. We're talking about a very hot political climate, a very emotional issue, as well as one that's going to have a huge amount of impact constitutionally and on the life of the country. And part of what we want to focus on here at the end is comparing this moment in time historically to what we also learn about the political process today, when we also look at emotionally charged issues and issues that could have a great deal of impact on the country. Sally Field, who portrays Mary Todd Lincoln in the film, spoke to this political climate a bit in the following clip.
It resonates so enormously on a world level about the difficulty, the messiness, the complicated nature of democracy, and how long it takes to really have it work, and how hard you have to work to keep it working. And that resonates all over the world right now, all over the world. And you have to want this noble notion of people governing themselves. You have to want it more than life.
I think that's really interesting, because obviously you don't get major change like this quickly. Lincoln had lived with this for a lengthy period of time. People in favor of his position had lived with it. Some of them wanting him to move much quicker, much faster. Some of them like being pulled and dragged and kicked to where he wanted to go. And yet the patience, the perseverance of the man speaks volumes about who he is.
It really does. And you mentioned Lincoln living with these individuals. Some of the individuals that are supporting him here in this time of decision-making around the 13th Amendment had been extremely critical of him for more than a decade for not being more aligned with an abolitionist platform. And so it really is a unique opportunity when we can look back and assess his patience, his willingness to continue to bring disparate groups together toward a common goal, and to work with political leaders that he didn't always see eye to eye with.
As we begin to talk about the comparisons to the legislative process today, the political deal-making and all that kind of thing, and obviously you've seen a lot of it historically, there are some major comparisons, right?
There are some excellent comparisons, and I think what this shows us is a really unique behind-the-scenes look at the process of governing that it really crosses the boundaries of time. And these kinds of discussions go on around major issues. Some of these issues go back to before Lincoln's time in the presidency. He was involved in immigration issues related to in the 1840s, following the Mexican-American War. And so, you can pick up a newspaper in any major city within a 2-week period, and the issue of immigration is going to be on one of those newspapers. So it is really something where Lincoln uses his skill and is able to make a difference in a very short amount of time.
Very good. Let's go back to Wisconsin. Elkhart Lake, a question from you?
Do you think you could tell us how Lincoln's early political failures maybe helped shape who he was as a politician in the 60s?
Super question.
Lincoln's early political failures played a tremendous role in hardening that character. Lincoln had been a successful representative in Illinois beginning in the early 1830s and served 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, but he wasn't reelected after the winter of 1841, and being in Springfield, he had a career mostly based as a lawyer. He engages in the political process again and is elected a congressman in 1847. Had a very, very uneventful, unsuccessful single term in Congress because he did object to the Mexican-American War. He was concerned about taking property from Mexico when he thought the issue of slavery might be fueling it. And then he fails to receive several different kinds of positions that would have been offered to him in the late 1840s. He strives for the U.S. Senate in 1854 and fails, has to run again in 1858 and go against his longtime rival, Stephen Arnold Douglas himself. And he fails at that attempt as well. So there are numerous professional setbacks, not to mention the personal setbacks that Lincoln encountered along with Mary and losing some of their children at very, very young ages to disease. And so at this time, he's always trying to hold together his legal practice and his own work so he can provide for his family, so he can improve upon their life, so he could send Robert to school, educational institutions Lincoln would have never dreamed of dealing in. And all of that plays a very important role in shaping his character, hardening it, but at the same time making it sensitive enough so that he can still be in touch with everyday folks. He can relate to them and understand what they're trying to communicate up the government process.
What kept him moving in spite of all those failures? Do his writings or letters give us a sense of that?
Well, Lincoln was a personally ambitious person. I think historians would definitely agree on that there is an inner drive in Abraham Lincoln. We've talked about the accessibility of Abraham Lincoln, yet some of those who knew him best also said that Lincoln had no one that was close to him. So it seemed as if those who got really close often felt then removed in a way as well. One of Lincoln's friends from Bloomington, Illinois, Leonard Swett, said that Lincoln moved individuals like pieces on a chessboard. That shows a very calculating man, someone who is removed from the strategy, but yet very well aware of the different movements that are going on in front of him. Very calculating person as well. And it's that calculation, that ambition, I think, that always refuels him. And you can't deny Mary's role in maintaining that along the way. She was a very politically ambitious individual herself. Mm-hmm. She had met Henry Clay as a young girl. That was Lincoln's political hero. And she was inspired to help an individual play a tremendous role in Illinois and national politics.
You talk a lot about Lincoln the man there at the end. One of the things that we wanted to give you guys a sense of also is what Steven Spielberg thought of this man, because obviously he spent a great deal of time with Lincoln, so to speak, planning the film, then directing the film. So let's hear from Spielberg himself.
Well, as to whether Lincoln was the greatest president we've ever, had in this country, Lincoln certainly guided our country through its worst crisis in its entire history, and more than any other single person, he helped the United States to survive. And we feel that in doing this, he helped the idea of democracy as a viable political system to survive. And more than any other single person, Lincoln helped end slavery.
The end of that quote reminds me about what Garrison said afterwards, that it was Lincoln, in spite of the fact that Garrison was kind of upset with Lincoln for taking so long to get there, it was Lincoln who made the difference when it came to this issue.
Absolutely, and I think other individuals at the time who had worked on abolitionist causes for a long time had very, very great words to say about Abraham Lincoln, including Frederick Douglass and others. And so it is a case of a single individual, what we call individual agency, making a difference. And I think that should give all the students who are participating or listening or might engage in this program after the taping sort of the reassurance that their voice does matter. And because of the events that we learn about in this film, you never know when you might be called upon, and you never know who's going to listen to you, who's going to follow you. That is the beauty of leadership in our democracy, and the movie reminds us that one person can make a difference.
A perfect segue to something that's just come to us via email, and that is the potential ramifications for the country if Lincoln had lived versus, of course, being assassinated. I mean, his second inaugural address, with malice toward none, with charity toward all, certainly indicated that he was really thinking about what we could do now to try to heal the country and move forward.
And that idea had been a constant thread in Lincoln's administration. He began his presidency reminding Southern states that he was not an enemy of theirs, and indeed he said we must be friends. So that is really a thread that runs throughout the Lincoln presidency. Historians tend to avoid those what-if questions, but it certainly encourages us to look back at the possibility of the political will that Lincoln had mustered within him, and the way that he exercised that in our process made us better as a country and enabled us to invite more people into that democratic process that Sally Field spoke so eloquently about.
Justin, thank you so much for being with us today. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks to all those students.
If you guys are in Springfield, Illinois, then for heaven's sakes, go around and visit Justin and the old state capitol and see all the sites that he's responsible for. It's well worth your time and effort to go to the Lincoln Law Office and everything that's there. I've been a couple of times myself. I would highly recommend it. Bye, everybody. As always, it's great to be with you on HEC TV Live.